In 1885, in a dusty corner of Wyoming Territory, one question followed a woman like a shadow. Why was the most beautiful woman in the territory still single? Men rode for days just to catch a glimpse of her face. Yet not one of them ever stayed long enough to ask for her hand. The answer, everyone assumed, was simple. The truth, as it turned out, was anything but simple at all. It had been buried quite literally for 2 long years, waiting quietly for someone stubborn enough to dig it back up into the light. The town called itself Redemption Creek, though few there had ever truly earned that name. Wagons rattled past a weathered church every single Sunday morning. Horses stood tied outside a crowded saloon every single night without fail. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone's business, and where secrets once buried rarely stayed buried for very long. Newcomers learned this lesson quickly, whether they wanted to or not. Clara Moreau walked to the general store every single morning at the very same hour. Heads turned the moment she stepped onto the street. Voices dropped to whispers behind cupped hands, whispers she had learned to recognize by their rhythm alone. Her heart still tightened every time, though her face never once let it show. She kept her chin high and her eyes forward, the way she had carefully trained herself to do for 2 long, lonely years. No man in Redemption Creek had asked for her hand in 2 years, not since the fire that took her husband Daniel from her in a single terrible night. The barn still stood in blackened ruins at the edge of her land, a charred reminder nobody in town let her forget. She passed it every single day on her way to the fields, and every day the ache felt exactly the same, sharp and quiet, like a wound that never fully closed. They called her the widow who brought misfortune wherever she walked. A curse, some whispered, clinging to her like smoke that never quite cleared from a room. Mothers pulled their sons away whenever her name came up over supper. Nobody thought to ask what had truly happened the night that barn burned down to ash. It was simply easier, it seemed, to believe a cruel rumor than to question one, no matter how much it hurt her. Silas Craig owned half the valley, and everyone in town knew it well. He owned the general store's debts. He owned the sheriff's patience, or so he liked to believe on his better days. And he fully intended one day soon to own the other half of that valley too. Clara's half, sitting right there for the taking, if only he could find the right way to finally take it from her. 2 years earlier, Clara had refused to sell him her land, plain and simple, without a moment's hesitation. She had looked him dead in the eye and said no, right there on her own porch in front of witnesses. Silas Craig was not a man accustomed to hearing that particular word from anyone, and in 2 full years he had never once forgiven her for saying it so plainly, so calmly, so completely without fear. But the truth behind that fire was buried deeper than anyone in Redemption Creek ever suspected, deeper than the ash, deeper than 2 long years of careful whispers. It waited there, patient as the valley itself, for someone brave enough or stubborn enough to finally dig it back up into daylight, no matter what it might cost him. Every dawn, Clara rose long before the sun climbed over the ridge. She tended cattle no man in town dared help her with, not since the whispers first began. Her hands had grown rough where they once were soft and gentle. Her back ached in ways a young widow's shouldn't have to bear alone. But the land still needed her, morning after morning, and she refused to let a single acre of it slip away. She mended fences with her own 2 hands, plank by stubborn, splintered plank. She plowed fields the whole town swore a woman couldn't manage alone. Every nail she drove home was quiet proof against the whispers chasing her. Proof that she didn't need a man just to survive out here. Even if, in the quiet hours before sleep found her, she still privately wished for one, more than she would ever admit out loud. At night, she sat alone at a table built for 2 full people. She listened to silence where laughter used to live, back when Daniel still filled that empty chair across from her. His chair stayed exactly where he'd left it, though she could never quite bring herself to sit in it or move it, or sell it to anyone at all. Grief, she had slowly learned, had a strange way of making furniture out of memory. On Sundays, she sat in the last pew, same as always, same as every single week before it. Nobody sat beside her. Nobody offered a hymn book, or a smile, or even a kind word once the service ended. She had grown used to walking out alone, past families who wouldn't quite meet her eyes, into a sun that never seemed to warm her the same way twice, no matter the season. Only the Reverend Abel Whitfield ever met her eyes without a trace of judgment in them. He had buried Daniel 2 years back, and he had watched Clara carry that heavy weight alone ever since, week after silent week. He never once believed the rumors the whole town whispered so freely. But even his quiet kindness couldn't silence an entire valley's gossip on its own, no matter how gently he tried. Still, some nights, she allowed herself to hope for something more than this quiet, lonely life. That someone, somewhere, might ride into Redemption Creek and see clean past the rumors entirely. That someone might finally look at her and see a woman, not a curse wearing a woman's face. She didn't know it yet, standing there at dusk, but hope was already riding toward her that very evening, closer than she dared imagine.
Stay away from
That same evening,
Clara Moreau.
a stranger rode slowly into Redemption Creek,
town.
tired from the road. Dust clung thick to his boots and the hem of his long duster. His eyes searched the street the way a man searches for something he can't quite name yet. He had no real plans to stay long in a town this small and quiet. Fate, it seemed, had other, far more stubborn plans in mind for him entirely. Word spread fast the way it always did in a town that small. A drifter had taken a room above the saloon for the night. Nobody knew his name yet. Nobody knew where exactly he'd come from, or why a man like him would stop in a town this quiet and forgotten. But everybody in Redemption Creek already had a theory ready by supper time, whether it was true or not. By his second night in town, the bartender leaned in close and warned him plainly, lowering his voice first. "Stay away from the widow," he said quietly. "She brings nothing but bad luck to any man foolish enough to get close to her." He said it the way folks repeat things so often, they've simply stopped questioning whether any of it is even true. Jonas said nothing in reply, just turned his glass slowly on the worn counter. But something in that warning settled strangely in his chest, refusing to sit quiet for long. A whole town warning a stranger away from one single woman over one old rumor felt less like fact and more like a story someone had built on purpose, and Jonas had learned the hard way to distrust stories built like that, brick by careful brick. The next morning, Clara's wagon wheel cracked loudly right outside the general store, spilling supplies into the dust. She knelt down, trying stubbornly to fix it herself, the way she fixed nearly everything else in her life. Jonas was the only man on that whole street who stepped forward to help her. Everyone else simply watched from a careful, deliberate distance, exactly as they always did and always would. Their eyes met for a long, unhurried moment in the middle of that busy street. Neither one looked away first, though both of them probably should have out of caution. In that single second, something passed quietly between them that neither could yet put an honest name to. It felt, Clara would later admit to herself, like the first genuinely honest thing to happen to her in 2 whole years. Jonas fixed the wheel without needing to be asked twice about it. Clara thanked him quietly, already bracing herself for him to walk away, the way every other man in town eventually did sooner or later, without fail. She had learned not to expect kindness to stay around very long. She had learned that particular lesson the hard way, more times than she cared to count. He didn't walk away that day, though, not even once he'd finished the repair. Instead, he quietly offered to walk her wagon all the way home himself. She hesitated at first, glancing toward the townsfolk already watching from their porches. Then, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she decided she simply didn't care what any of them thought about it. Not tonight. Mrs. Edna Parker watched from her porch, already whispering urgently to her neighbor before the wagon had even passed the church. By supper time that same evening, half the town had heard some version of the story unfold. Each version, quite naturally, growing a little worse and stranger than the one that came right before it. The next day, Jonas returned to her farm anyway, tools slung over his shoulder. He offered to mend her barn roof for nothing more than a plate of supper in return. Clara studied his face for a long, careful moment, searching for the catch hidden somewhere behind the offer. She didn't manage to find one anywhere in his eyes, so cautiously, hesitantly, she said yes to him. For a full week, he steadily repaired what 2 long years of neglect had slowly broken apart. He fixed the roof beam by careful beam. He mended every fence along her whole property line, He asked for nothing from her in return, but easy, unhurried conversation over supper each evening. She began to laugh again, quietly, whenever she thought no one else was listening in close. One evening, Clara finally told him the whole quiet story about Daniel, about the fire that had taken him from her in a single, terrible, roaring night, about the guilt she still quietly carried, though she had never once understood exactly what she was guilty of. Jonas listened patiently, without interrupting a single word of it, letting her finish at her own pace. When she finally finished, Jonas spoke plainly, the same steady way he spoke about most things in his life. "A fire doesn't choose who deserves the grief that follows it," he told her gently, taking her hand. "It only takes whatever happens to be standing in its path that night." She had never once heard anyone put it quite that simply or that kindly before this moment. Something in her chest loosened quietly that night, for the first time in 2 long, heavy years of holding on so tightly. She held Daniel's photograph a little longer than usual, before finally setting it back down on the shelf beside her bed. It wasn't quite goodbye, exactly, not in the way she had feared it might feel. It felt more like permission, finally granted to keep on living her own life fully. Silas Craig noticed the stranger's horse tied outside Clara's barn far too often for his liking now. He sat up on the ridge above her land, watching quietly, the way a man watches something he still privately considers his own property. The sight of it soured his mood considerably every single time he laid eyes on it, and it happened almost daily now. He decided the old rumor needed reinforcing again, and soon, before it faded entirely from the town's careful memory. 2 years of patient, careful whispers were not about to be undone by one drifter with a hammer and a few spare afternoons. Silas began writing letters that very night, choosing every word with the cold care of a man carefully building a trap. The town announced its autumn social, the single biggest gathering Redemption Creek held all year long without fail. Every family for miles around would surely be there that night. It was the kind of evening where reputations got made, and just as easily unmade, in front of the whole valley at once, under one shared roof, for everyone to see and judge. Jonas asked Clara to attend the social as his own personal guest that year, standing nervously at her gate. She hesitated at first, imagining every single eye in that crowded hall, turning toward them the moment they walked through its doors together. Then she looked at him, standing there so plainly unafraid of what people might think of it, and she said yes anyway, her heart pounding. Silas visited the saloon again that same night, before the social had even properly begun. He reminded every man in that crowded room of the fire, and gently, deliberately, exactly who they ought to blame for it deep down. He never once said Clara's name out loud, not even a single time. He never actually had to say it at all, and everyone understood him perfectly. By morning, the whispers had hardened into open, spoken warnings around the whole town. Neighbors who had said nothing for 2 full years suddenly found plenty to say about it now, and loudly. The rumor, freshly fed by Silas's careful, poisonous words, spread through Redemption Creek faster than any real fire ever could have spread on its own. Reverend Whitfield pulled Jonas quietly aside before the social started that evening, his voice low and clearly urgent. "Be careful, son," he warned him gently, resting a hand on his shoulder. "This town doesn't forgive easily, and it forgives even less whenever a stranger tries to change its collective mind." Jonas thanked him sincerely for the warning, but he had no real intention of heeding it. Jonas answered him without a single moment's hesitation, his voice calm and certain. "Then this whole town is wrong about her," he said simply, and meant every word of it. He had ridden through enough forgotten towns and buried enough of his own private regrets to know the difference between honest truth and a story people had simply agreed together to believe. That evening, Clara wore her late mother's blue dress for the very first time in several years. She smoothed the soft fabric nervously in front of her mirror before finally stepping outside into the cool air. Jonas waited patiently by her gate, lantern in hand, looking at her the way no man had looked at her since Daniel was still alive and well. Together, they walked into the crowded town, social side by side, unhurried, arm in arm. Every single head in that hall turned to look at them the moment they entered. This time for an entirely different reason than usual, and Clara felt it instantly. For one brief, shining hour, it almost felt like Redemption Creek had finally let her back in for good. Silas approached them slowly near the punch table, wearing a practiced smile that never quite reached his cold eyes. He greeted Jonas warmly enough, right there in front of the whole watching room, the way a man greets someone he has already quietly decided to destroy. Clara felt her stomach tighten the instant she saw him drawing closer, and she reached for Jonas's hand. He raised his voice loud enough for the entire hall to hear him clearly, every syllable dripping with false concern. "Careful, stranger," he said, with mock concern dripping from every single word he spoke. "She's already buried one husband after all," he added cruelly. "Wouldn't want you joining him too soon." A sharp gasp rippled through the hall at once, and every eye turned toward Clara. Jonas stepped between them without a single moment's hesitation, his jaw set firm. "If you have real proof of wrongdoing," he said, his voice low and perfectly steady, "say it plainly right here in front of this entire town tonight. If you don't have proof, keep her name out of your mouth for good, starting this very moment." The room fell completely, utterly silent, every voice swallowed at once. Clara, humiliated beyond words in front of everyone she had ever known, turned and walked straight out into the cold night air alone. She had spent 2 long years learning how to bear the whispers quietly. She hadn't yet learned how to bear them, shouted across a crowded, staring room. Jonas found her outside a few minutes later, sitting alone on the porch steps of the hall, staring quietly at nothing at all. The music still drifted faintly from inside the crowded building behind her, muffled and distant. Out here, the only sound left was her quiet, controlled breathing, and the wind moving softly through the tall valley grass around them both. He knelt down beside her gently, without saying a single word at first, letting the silence settle. Then he made her a promise plainly, the same steady way he made every promise he'd ever kept. "I'm going to find out exactly what happened the night of that fire," he told her firmly, holding her gaze. "And I won't stop until this whole town finally knows the truth of it too." The next morning, Jonas rode straight out to the burned-out barn at the edge of Clara's quiet land. He searched carefully through ash that had waited 2 long years to finally speak its piece. Most men would have called it a hopeless search from the very start, not worth the effort. Jonas, as it happened, had never once been most men. Beneath a collapsed support beam, his searching fingers finally closed around something cold and metal, half buried in soot. A lantern, deliberately rigged with thin copper wire that didn't belong to any honest household accident at all. His stomach turned cold the instant he fully understood exactly what he was holding and what it truly meant for Clara. An old ranch hand, fearful and silent for 2 long years, finally found the courage to confess everything he knew. Silas Craig had paid him handsomely, he admitted quietly, hands trembling, to rig that very lantern the night of the fire. He had carried the crushing weight of that guilt alone, in silence, ever since that terrible, roaring night. Jonas rode straight to Sheriff Tom Bragg's office, the lantern wrapped carefully in cloth beside him the whole ride there. He set it down firmly on the desk without a single word of preamble. Then he told the sheriff everything he'd learned that day, plainly, the same steady way he told most things in his life. Sheriff Bragg examined the lantern carefully first, turning it slowly, then read the written confession through twice over. His jaw tightened with every single line he read on that page. "This is enough," he finally said aloud, setting the paper down firmly. "More than enough for me to ride out there myself, right now, today, before another hour passes." Together they rode straight to Silas Craig's ranch, the truth riding along beside them like a third silent companion. Neither man spoke much at all along the dusty way there. There wasn't really much left to say that the evidence in Jonas's saddlebag hadn't already said plainly and completely enough on its own. Silas denied absolutely nothing the moment he saw that lantern in the sheriff's raised hand. His face drained completely of color right there on his own porch, in front of them both. He opened his mouth once, as if to argue his case, then closed it again just as quickly, defeated. His silence, in the end, was confession enough for everyone standing there watching. Sheriff Bragg placed him firmly under arrest for arson and for the death of Daniel Moreau 2 long years prior. 2 full years of whispered rumor collapsed entirely in the span of one single, ordinary afternoon. Justice, it turned out, had only ever been quietly waiting for someone willing enough to go looking for it properly, no matter how long it took. By sundown that same day, all of Redemption Creek knew the whole shocking truth of it. The curse everyone had whispered about for so long had never once belonged to Clara at all, not for one single day. It had always belonged to Silas Craig, hidden carefully behind his money and his careful, practiced smiles. The whole valley seemed to exhale together at once, as if released from a spell. Clara stood quietly at her own gate as the news finally reached her, tears falling freely at last for a grief she no longer had to carry entirely alone. 2 years of whispered blame lifted clean off her shoulders in a single quiet, overwhelming moment. She had almost forgotten what genuine relief actually felt like inside her chest, warm and light and true. Jonas rode back to her that very same evening. The lantern's hard-won truth finally settled quietly behind him at last. He dismounted slowly, watching her stand there patiently in the fading golden light, waiting for him. 2 years of cruel rumor, undone completely in a single remarkable afternoon. And still, somehow, he found he wanted to ask her for something even more than that. He took her hands gently in his own, steadying his voice carefully before he finally spoke his whole heart. "You are the most beautiful woman in this whole territory," he told her plainly, without a trace of doubt in his voice. "So tell me, why are you still single?" he asked softly. "Marry me, Clara. I mean every single word of it, completely and forever." Clara laughed through her tears, a bright, unguarded sound she genuinely hadn't made in 2 full years. "Yes," she whispered back at first, barely audible over the evening wind. Then louder, sure of every single syllable this time around, her voice steady and full. 1,000 times yes, she said again, holding on to him tightly, as if she might never let go. Within a month, all of Redemption Creek gathered for a wedding nobody had honestly thought they would ever see happen. Flowers lined the little wooden church for the first time in years, bright and fragrant in the morning air. Even Mrs. Edna Parker, red-faced with quiet shame, showed up carrying a pie for the occasion, saying nothing at all about the past. Reverend Whitfield pronounced them husband and wife beneath a sky the color of brand new beginnings, warm gold spilling through the windows. He had waited 2 long years to finally see Clara smile the way she smiled that particular afternoon, radiant and unguarded. Some prayers, he liked to say afterward, simply take their own good time to be properly answered. Sometimes the truth simply takes its time to finally surface, no matter how deep it was buried. But it always arrives eventually before it becomes too late for the people who need it most desperately. And love, when it's real, when it's patient and honest and stubborn enough to wait, always finds a way to arrive right on time exactly when it's needed most of all.